This is a webinar on windproof a roof, or as I call it, roofing in high wind zones, or asphalt shingle roofing in high wind zones. So we're going to specifically talk about asphalt shingles in high wind zones, because of all the different types of roofing, that's probably the most prone to blow-offs in high wind areas. Plus, it's about 84% of all roofs that are installed in the United States. Steel roofing, tile roofing, and some of the other composite roofings or wood roofing, those all tend to have a little bit higher wind resistant just because of the way they don't have as many edges. And that's what we'll talk mostly about. It's all about edges. Well, not completely about edges, but a lot of it's about edges. So we're going to talk about 9 different things you can do when installing shingles, or prepping is a good part of it, prepping for installing shingles to make them more wind resistant. The photograph, though it's fuzzy, that you see on the screen now is from it's actually not from a job I worked on. This was across the street from a house that I was doing a full gut rehab on about 27 or 28 years ago. And we had, this is along a bay in Rhode Island. And it was, I think the day before we had some gale force winds. So they got up to about 65 miles an hour, which really isn't that fast when it comes to roof shingles. They should be able to handle that without a problem. But this was the winter season, or cooler, early spring. So the roof had just been installed a couple days before on this house. And when we got there in the morning, we could see there were shingles blown all across the yard, and you can see big patches of shingles which had been ripped right off, and you can still see it was windy that morning. The shingles just lifting right up. So just goes to show you an example of roof shingles that didn't quite make it. And I don't know what they did, because that evening we were expecting thunderstorms or a lot of rain, and I didn't see anybody out there to take any measures to patch that up that day. So we're going to go over 9 different things. We're going to talk about drip edges, even though you don't really think they're related to roofing or holding roofs in place or holding roof shingles in place. It is really one of the more important things you can do, is picking the right drip edge and installing it in a wind-resistant fashion. Shingle selection, of course, which is pretty easy. Bonding the shingles around the perimeter, that'd be at rake edges, at Eave edges. The choice of nails, that's not so much on the wind resistance, that's more so on the longevity of roofs, but it can have an impact, particularly if you're going to use stainless steel nails. The smooth shank stainless nails just are very smooth. They tend to pull out a bit. The overhang and a limit on that of the shingles beyond the drip edge. The pattern and the quality of the nail installation, where you're going to put it on the shingles. Talk about that a little bit in detail, because a lot of things about the construction of shingles that play into this. Hip and ridge fastening, the ridge vent selection, and then in cold weather at least, hand sealing shingles for better adhesion until the self-seal strip can take over. This is based on an article that I did it appeared in Fine Homebuilding in March of 2019. So that was just a little over a year ago. 9 upgrades to windproof your roof. Some of the photos you'll see today will be from that. And Matt was out taking the photographs, so a lot of his pictures are in this presentation, as well as that article. We did a article that's related to this in December 2012, which was on stormproofing a roof. And I did a webinar last week, last Friday, on stormproofing a roof. And you can see that if you didn't catch it when we presented it last Friday, you can catch that on the Fine Homebuilding website in their the webinar section. You can find that right off the home page. Click on that and you'll see all the webinars that have been put up in the last month or so since they started doing it. A few resources that you can rely on or go read more about. One is the Fortified Home Program standards. There are roofing and re-roofing, and they kind of combine them too. Now it just says re-roofing, so don't be confused by the slide I have up here where it says re-roofing. Information is the same. Hurricane they have one checklist for, and high wind and hail they have a checklist for. And these standards are developed by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. If you haven't been to their website, they've got tons of great information on building homes and making them more disaster resistant, both fire resistant, wind resistant, seismic resistant, and so on. They have a facility in Richburg, South Carolina, that they can, inside of that building, as you can see on this left-hand photograph where there's a piece of a building flying off, they can build two-story, I want to say like 2,000 or 2,500 square foot homes, which I've done several times. And then they put 105 fans. It's like the wall of wind. This whole big wall, which is I think 4 stories or 5 stories tall, has 105 fans, each that can generate, or that each that are powered by 350 horsepower motors that can generate 130 mile per hour winds inside that building. So they can test out all of the roofing and siding and all sorts of other details, construction wise, load path and so on. And so those 2 documents I mentioned before were all based on the research that they did using their test facility to see what would help to improve the roof. And really what it comes down to is a bunch of small incremental changes. So I started doing this, you know, roofing in high wind zones going back years ago myself when we build houses and do additions, and just doing little things that just sort of made sense intuitively to make the house or make the roof more wind resistant. But the nice thing was to see that the Institute for Business and Home Safety, their testing has showed that a lot of the things that we did intuitively, and a lot of other roofers and contractors as well, have been shown to be effective. I'll be referring in a couple of cases over to the International Builders Code, the IRC, International Residential Code, and the 2018 version of that. I do want to mention safety. Home building is inherently dangerous, and some of the pictures that you'll see, like this one here, I'll be doing things that are completely unsafe and shouldn't be done by anybody. So just, you know, even though you'll see me doing things in photographs that aren't safe, don't do that yourself. You know, judge what's safe for you and the situation you're in, and follow good safety measures, particularly for fall protection up on roofs. So Matt, you remember drip edges when we did those.
Oh yeah.
And we had you taking photographs of the drip edges, but one thing we didn't have you take pictures of was the different types of drip edges that are out there on the, that are used typically. So that's something that didn't appear in the magazine that I wanted to bring up here, because a lot of the drip edges that people use are, I would say, a little bit against code. Won't meet building code, even though they're readily sold in lumber yards and home centers, or they're either too small or too thin, and then fastening them is particularly important. As far as the style of drip edge, whether you have one like the one on the left here where it's got the extended drip edge, I think they call these type D. Yeah, I think they call them type D. There's a couple different letter designations they have for these. I call them extended edge. Whether it's an extended edge or whether it is just a flush edge like the one on the right, there have been no reported impacts based or wind resistance problems with either of these styles. So either of them is suitable both for rake edges and for eave edges, though some people will stick with the extended version for the eave edge, and then along rake edges they might use the flush one. But for the most part, the style doesn't matter. The locations, and this gets to the code, are going to be along the eave edge and the rake edge. It wasn't until the 2012 International Residential Code that metal drip edges were required at all. Before that, as far as the code was concerned, there wasn't anything specifically called out in the code requiring drip edges. But when they did start to include it in 2012, it's pretty much remained the same until now. And I just abbreviated a section down to the important parts for our discussion here. Drip edges shall extend back onto the roof deck or the roof sheathing, not less than 2 inches. So you can see over here in the lower right-hand corner, that drip edge that's being installed. When you've got the extended drip edge style, and then it has the roof or the fascia leg that comes down, usually that's set at about a 90-degree angle to the roof leg, the fascia leg, and that's just when they fabricate it. But if you install it like it's being installed here, where you don't go and bend that fascia leg yourself to be a little bit more in plane with the fascia, what ends up happening is the roof leg, particularly on these shorter ones, these are called a 5-inch flashing, but it's not really 5 inches from the tip of the eave edge up to the top edge along the roof plane face. It's 5 inches in total length if you measure the full perimeter. That's the way they usually measure drip edges. The down leg, the reverse leg back out for that extended drip edge, and then the whole top portion going up the roof plane. So you can see here, if you don't bend that leg, that fascia leg, so that it is in plane with the fascia, then very little of that top edge of the drip edge actually goes onto the roof plane, so it wouldn't meet the building codes because we have to be at least 2 inches on the roof deck. So a better choice might be the drip edge that we're installing here on the left side, where this is an 8-inch drip edge, where it has about 1 inch or 1 1/4 inch fascia leg, but you've got at least about a good 5 or 6 inches of roof deck plane on that roof deck leg, so that when you put that down on the roof, you're ensured of getting the full 2 inches. And then under the section of drip edges, or the section of flashings, I should say, where it talks about locations, it says where flashing is of metal, the metal shall be corrosion resistant with a thickness not less than 19 thousandths of an inch. And that's not very thick. It's very, very thin. But a lot of the drip edges that are used today don't meet that thickness requirement. I should say that are available at the lumberyard. So I went out in my shed just to grab a bunch of scrap pieces, and then I took a micrometer, which I don't use very much in construction, but it is a handy device to be able to see what the thickness of things is. So when you read off the scale, there's a little 0 line right there where I'm pointing my arrow. And then as you turn the dial, it'll read off in thousandths of an inch. So you can see this drip edge here, which is this brown one on the left-hand side, is just a little over 19 thousandths of an inch thick. So that would meet the building code. This one here, which is an older drip edge, which I pulled off of a job where we were re-roofing it. This was from the drip edge was originally installed in the 1960s. And when I got the mic on there, it's almost 24 thousandths of an inch thick. So it's probably 50% thicker or 30-something% thicker than what the code would require. But then all of these drip edges on the right-hand side, these 4 that you see here, of which those are all stocked at my local lumberyard, or a couple of them at my local lumberyard. When I put the micrometer on those, they're just under 11 thousandths of an inch. So they're only about half of the thickness that's required by the code, figuring 19 thousandths of an inch by code. And here we've got 10 or 100, well, it'd be 10.9 thousandths of an inch, so just a little bit over half the thickness. And it can make a difference in a strong windstorm, be it a hurricane or a low-grade tornado. The nailing pattern is important when you're going to install the drip edge. So the code only requires that we space out the nails, and these would be roofing nails at 12 inches on center. But what the Fortified Home program recommends is that we bring that down to, and it's also a FEMA bulletin for roofing at high wind zones, also talks about this, bringing that nailing pattern down to 4 inches. And instead of just doing them all 4 inches apart in a straight line, go in an up-down pattern, like you can see in the lower left here, where it's up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. So you get this basically 2 parallel rows of nails that when you measure them from the up to the down part, they're about 4 inches apart. So it's not 2 rows at 4 inches, it's 1 row at 8 inches, the second row at 8 inches, and then those 2 rows being offset by a couple of inches. And then what I try to do, though it's not something that's required in the fortified home program, but it just makes good sense, is where you can, knowing that generally speaking, your roof nails will penetrate through the sheathing, maybe by 1/4 of an inch or so, maybe even a little bit more, is if there's a subfascia or solid fascia blocking or solid blocking behind the fascia, driving nails into that blocking. And at least, if you can, you probably have roof rafters or roof trusses every 16 inches or 24 inches on center. Try to hit the nails to go into those framing members, because anything you can do to keep that drip edge intact during a windstorm, you're going to help to keep the whole roof installed, because we're going to end up sealing those shingles down to that drip edge. So it isn't just to get the drip and the water away, it's also to hold the shingles in place. Now, shingle selection, and I think, Matt, you did a little bit of the research on this, didn't you, when you were looking at the different wind speed? Would you like to say anything about the wind speed and the ratings on this? Or
I can't really quite remember. It's been so long.
Okay, so
it's in the brain and out.
Okay, yeah, well, that's a problem. That's why I sent you this ahead of time, so you can refresh your memory. So there's 2 standards you can go by. And there's this one, and it's been around for years, this ASTM 3161. And everything I've read from that talk about high wind roofing, they say, don't even look at that ASTM 3161. If you see some companies say, oh, we meet the, whatever standard for that. Because the reason for that is their highest rating only goes up to 110 miles an hour. Which isn't actually that high of a wind speed as far as a rating goes, because we can get shingles up to 130 to 150 miles an hour. And it makes a big difference. You think, between 90 and 100 is only 10 miles an hour, and between 100 and 110 is only an additional 10 miles an hour. But every time you increase in those 10-mile-an-hour increments over about 90 miles an hour, the impact on the roof is amplified. It goes up a lot more. So it's not just a linear increase in the amount of damage that can be done as the wind speed goes up. It actually goes up kind of in a steeper and steeper incline. So the impact can be a lot higher. The standard you want to look for when you're looking at a bundle of roof shingles or manufacturer's information is the ASTM 7158. And for the most part, you only want to be purchasing the shingles if you're in a wind zone, say a hurricane zone of 120 miles an hour or less. You want to look for the G or the H rated shingles, and anything 120 miles an hour or above, look for the shingles that are rated to an H category, because those are going to be the most wind resistance that you can get. And those would be suitable right through the southern tip of Florida, where they get the highest 150 mile an hour wind speed. So once you pick the shingles, then you got to get them stuck down to the roof, at least along the perimeter. So we got two cases. We got the rake edge, talk about that separately from this part here on the Eave edge. So at the Eave edge, we got a couple choices. We can use a self-adhering starter strip, and several companies make a self-adhering starter strip. It's like peel and stick. It's already got the self-sealed tabs along the bottom to seal down that first shingle that'll overlay it. But you want to make sure that that starter strip isn't just nailed down mechanically. You want to make sure that it is sealed down in addition to the nails. So if you don't, so some of those self-sealing starter strips are manufactured by the shingle manufacturers themselves. A couple like Atlas and GAF have those available, but not all companies have the rollout self-adhering. But there are some aftermarket companies that do make a starter strip that you can get and use with any shingle manufacturer. In lieu of that, if you want to stick with standard cut shingles that already have the self-steel strip and then just bond those down yourself, two choices are an 8-inch wide, and this 8-inch comes from the research done by the Institute for Business and Home Safety. They determined that an 8-inch wide strip of trowelable roof cement right over the drip edge, which is another reason why it's nicer to have that taller roof leg drip edge, so you've got a bunch of that down, and then onto either your ice barrier or your underlayment, provided that's been nailed down adequately as well. So an 8-inch wide band of roof cement, which I've tried, and it's time consuming, it's messy, and particularly in cold weather, it can be difficult because you can't have that any thicker than 1/8 of an inch thick. Once you get beyond 1/8 of an inch thick, the problem is that because it is an asphalt based product, the oils that are in that asphalt will end up deteriorating the actual shingle, or actually softening the starter shingle you put over it, which will make that kind of fall apart over time. So a very thin layer, just less than 1/8 of an inch. Or what I end up using, and right now I only know of one product on the market that'll do this, but I'm sure over time other companies will come up with it. It's double-sided self-adhering membrane, where you can bond one side down just like you would with any peel and stick roof underlayment, but it has a release paper on the top of it where you peel that off, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. It leaves a sticky side facing up so that you can bond down a regular starter strip. So the one product I'm familiar with is called Roof Edge Seal. Protector Wrap makes that. You know, I had a picture there. Oh, I was working on this and I had this picture I just took to put on, and I forgot to put it on. It was just showing using the roof edge seal along the eave edge.
Yeah.
Well, here it is going up along the rake edge. So rake edges are not going to be, I don't recommend, although some roofing manufacturers, roof shingle manufacturers will recommend taking a starter strip and running it up the rake edge, because they'll want their little self-seal tabs to be right along the drip edge side. Instead of that, because of what the research from for the Fortified Home program showing that we want to get a better bond than just a little dabs of self-seal strip on the starter strips along the rake edge, you want something wider, 8 inches wide. So you've got two choices there. One along a rake edge would be a 8-inch wide band of roof cement, or that same stuff like I'm using here, the roof edge seal, so that when that last 8 inches of shingle will end up being bonded down. Now, of course, you know, as you're putting the shingles on, because one layer overlaps the next all the way up, only the top lap of the shingle, the upper portion above the shingle head lap of the shingle below, is going to be in direct contact with this double-sided self-adhering membrane or the roof tar. You're still going to need to go back later and dab that corner shingle. I'll talk about that, the corner of the shingle on the outside. I'll go back and talk about that in a few more slides. The important thing, though, is that you're bonding the head lap of the shingle down all the way up, because that makes the overall edge more wind resistance. The idea there being that if you can keep the perimeter of those shingles stuck down to the roof edge, that's your most prone point, because as wind comes and blows along that roof edge, that's going to tend to lift the roof edge up. And as the roof edge gets lifted up, once you lose the bottom course of shingles, it's just like a domino effect, and the shingles can get ripped up all the way up the roof. So nail selection. There's a lot of different nails out there on the market. The nail length you got to pay attention to, and that's driven by code and manufacturers' requirements. The length you have to penetrate at least through whatever the roof sheathing is. So if you've got 1/2 inch roof sheathing, then you're going to want to make sure the tips of those nails, about at least 1/8 of an inch, is penetrating through the roof. Now, if you want to go a little bit more and have the nail sticking through 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch, that's fine. But at least the diamond point of the tip has to penetrate through the roof sheathing. Now, if the roof sheathing is 3/4 of an inch or thicker, a lot of the re-roofs that I end up doing are over some old pine or oak planks. So those old boards that were put up were a full inch or 1.16 thick. And in those cases, we have to drive the nails to be at least 3/4 inch embedment into the solid wood. So it gives you a choice there, either all the way through the roof sheathing if the sheathing's less than 3/4, or penetrate 3/4 into 3/4 or thicker roof sheathing. Now, smooth or ring shank, you don't see a whole lot of roofs that get ripped off because the actual nails tear through the shingle, or excuse me, get pulled out of the roof sheathing. That just doesn't happen very often, even on with the smoother shank, like an electro galvanized or a smooth shank stainless steel. But you do have the option, if you are concerned about it. There are some companies that do make ring shank roofing nails. Usually those are going to be in the hot dip galvanized group or in the stainless steel group. Now, if you're working within, say, 1 or 2 miles of salt water, then corrosion resistance becomes an issue, because a lot of the electro galvanized nails, like the coil that you see on the left, they meet a standard, and that standard is a pretty low bar. And I've gone back, and I'm sure some of you have gone, and when you've done strip and re-roofs, have seen the roofing nails, particularly with the electro galvanized, where they started to corrode. And it's only a matter of time before the head, because the heads on roofing nails are very thin to begin with, start to corrode away enough that that the nails no longer have a good shoulder on the nail to resist pull through. So in those areas closer to the shore, closer to salt water, like the Gulf Coast of the US, West Coast, Pacific Coast, and up along the eastern seaboard, going with a hot dip galvanized is going to give you a lot more corrosion resistance, or going with stainless steel. I mean, we don't talk much about stainless steel in the roofing business, but it is available. And when you figure the cost of re-roofing a house today and how long shingles last, it's one thing if you're putting down the old 3-tab 15-year shingle and use electro galvanized, chances are the shingles will wear out even along the coast before the nails corrode bad enough for it to be a problem. But what happens now is, with the 50-year and lifetime warranty shingles, those shingles, and I've got 35-year shingles on my house, and they're 25 years old now, and they look like they got at least another 15 or 20 years left in them. So that with the shingles lasting longer, we got to make sure we choose a nail that's going to last longer, particularly in those coastal areas. This is one that drives a lot of roofers absolutely insane. The standard way of installing roof shingles when I started in the business a long time ago was we'd overhang the shingle beyond the drip edge or beyond the roof edge by at least 1/2 and maybe even 3/4 of an inch. That would be both along the rake and along the eave edge. But from a wind resistance standpoint, the best bet is to actually put the shingles flush with the drip edge. Do not overhang it at all. And a lot of people think, well, no, the water's going to roll around that edge and get in the joint between the shingle and the drip edge. And well, yep, it might a little bit, but that's why we've got that self-adhered membrane down there to help resist that intrusion of water, or that row, the self-sealing starter strip, or we put down some tar or that double back sticky tape. That's going to help to resist the water getting in between the layers there. If you do want to install a overhang, then limit it to 1/4 of an inch. I've pretty much gone to a 0 tolerance, just flush, no overhang at all. After seeing, when you watch some of the videos that you can see at the Institute for Business and Home Safety's website, and you watch just how the shingles and the roofs get lifted right up and off, and you see how that leading edge just comes flying right off when they extend the overhang of the shingle. By limiting that overhang, you're going to limit the problem with the wind getting purchased under that and ripping it off. Now the nailing. Now this is something, Matt, when you and I did the article, we never really discussed, because you just took pictures of the way we were installing the shingles where we were there. Have you ever seen the two different patterns for 6-nail patterns for high wind nailing and the different shingles?
Yeah, I can't remember. I think we may have taken some pictures of that. I don't know if they made it into the article or not. They probably didn't, but the yeah, a lot of it was just manufacturer centric. It wasn't necessarily, like, dealer's choice. Like, you didn't get to do what you wanted to do necessarily. They typically had instructions on the package showing you exactly what they wanted you to do for high wind.
Yeah, and that's usually the case. That's what's going to drive you here. So the standard installation for shingles for most basic wind zones are going to be 4 nails per shingle. For high wind zones, all of the manufacturers except for one, when they, I shouldn't say that. This was as of 5 years ago when I checked last on this, but in order for some of those shingle, let me put it this way, in order for some of the shingle manufacturers to reach that H designation for that ASTM standard for the wind rating for the shingles, they had to go to a 6-nail pattern. All the manufacturers offer that as an option where you can go with a 6-nail pattern. I know one company, Atlas, was able to meet the 150-mile-an-hour wind test with 4 nails. So you could just stick with that particular shingle, and there might be some others. But for the small incremental cost of adding the extra nails in there, to me, it's a no-brainer to go with a 6-nail pattern for any brand of shingle that you're using. Here in Rhode Island, where I work, I don't have an option. Our building code was amended from what the IRC calls for. We don't have a choice. We have to put 6 nails in any shingle, regardless, because we're in a high wind zone. But as Matt mentioned, the shingle manufacturers pretty much designate how the pattern goes. And the one is a 6-nail pattern evenly across the face of the shingle, which for most of the metric shingles nowadays ends up being in the range of about 7.5 inches apart. So your end nails, of course, are going to be about an inch, 1.25 inches in from both the left and the right side. And then all of the sequential nails down the row are going to be at that 7.5 inch. Now, some companies will give you a range of like between 6.5 and 9 inches to have those nails spaced apart. So that way, if you're using a roofing nailer, you don't have to be precise with the positioning. But one thing to be cognizant of is that you just don't want to put those nails anywhere and everywhere, because when the manufacturers do come up with these patterns, that pattern for the nails does correspond with the starter group pattern that creates that somewhat of a step or a pyramid or a stair-like pattern for the joint offset when you work from a rake edge to start that beginning group of shingles before you run the courses across the field. If you follow their pattern for the cuts of the shingles to start a group going up that stair step, that will ensure that your nails are at least 2 or 3 inches away from any joints in the butts of 2 shingles. So it's when you start to either put more nails in or vary from that 6-nail pattern that you're more likely to have a problem where the nails are either directly below or very close to the joint. Not that it's a water leak problem so much as it's a problem where you're going to get a little bit more moisture in the butt joint between the shingles, so that means there's going to be more potential for corrosion. So the shingles I got marked there on the left-hand side, the GAF, Tamco, Atlas, Malarkey, and BP, those all have the 6 pattern evenly across the face of the shingle, whereas Owens Corning, CertainTeed, and ICO shingles, what they do instead is they space the nails to get 6 nails at the, basically it's a 4-inch pattern you would do across the face of a shingle, but instead of putting just a single nail at the 12 to 13 inch range in from the left and the right side. They do it at a pair of nails spaced between 1 and 2 inches apart. So it'd be 1 to 2 inches apart for those pair of nails, but you've got that spread of like 12 and a half, 13 inches between the groups of nails all the way down. Now, I've talked to several of the manufacturers when I bump into them at trade shows over the years just to see what their take is on each other's patterns. And most of them agree when I talk to the technical reps, and they have, if you do prefer one pattern over the other, if you look at their technical bulletins, which are sort of in addition to their standard installation guides, most of them will recognize the alternate pattern. So you could, if you just check to make sure with Owens Corning, CertainTeed, or ICO, you could do the evenly spaced pattern or vice versa. I know I've used Atlas shingles on a number of jobs in the last few years, and I check with their technical reps, and they let me do a 12 and a half or a 13-inch spacing for the shingles, for the nails, and do them in pairs. Just because I find it easier to visually space the nails as I'm bopping along with the nail gun to hit that 1/4, 3/4, then, or what is it, 1/3, 2/3, yeah, and if, yeah, 1/3,
Yeah.
2/3 position where you can, I do the pair of nails and the pair of nails. I also find it faster. I just do a bop up at those two spots. So they said, yeah, no problem. As long as you got the 6 on there, then you're covered. Now the location on the shingles, and again, Matt and I probably took photos of this, the common bond area, but a lot of times, when Matt comes out to do the photos for articles, we end up taking a zillion pictures, and because they only have 4 or 6 pages to be able to print an article, we can't fit all of the important information in, which is a nice thing about these webinars, because we can cover stuff we couldn't in the article. And that's like this, is where on the shingles the nails can or should go. And you can see here's an example of 4 different shingles showing what they give us for indicators where the nails should go on their shingle. The one on the right, there's no line or indicator at all visible, and you just have to refer to the instructions, and they'll give you a distance of like 3/8 inch up off of the cutout, and then no more than, say, I don't know what it is, 5/8 of an inch up. They give you a pretty narrow line. Then with the Owens Corning, I think they're the only ones I know of now that have the reinforcing, and it's only on, I believe, their duration shingles. They give a reinforcing strip. It used to be a plastic strip years ago when it first came out. Now it's a fabric strip. And that's a amazingly durable strip. I've tried pulling a shingle off a roof after I've done it, and I can actually tear the asphalt apart before I'll tear off that fabric through the nail head itself. But that gives you a clear indicator of where the nail should go. And then the black one towards the left center side, that's a CertainTeed shingle. And on this particular model, I don't remember which model it is, but they give us 3 lines. They give us a pair of lines close to and just above the cutout. Then they give you a line way up high. Now, it's important to read the instructions on what those lines indicate. If you want to be roofing in a high wind zone, you're going to have to hit the nail between those 2 narrow lines at the bottom. And you'll see why in a moment when I show you some cross sections of these shingles. The upper portion, you can put a nail in, but you don't get the same wind resistance. That's mainly because you're only trapping 1 layer of the shingles, just a top lap under the head of the shingles, which basically you got half the thickness. And then the shingle here on the left is an Atlas. And what they do is they put 2 bands of self-seal strip on their shingles. And what you can do, and you have to read the instructions to understand it, is you can nail anywhere from the top of the upper seal strip to the bottom of the lower seal strip. So you got about 1 3/8 to 1.5 inches range there, where you can safely put the nail. Now, when you look at these in section, here's where you get into the construction of the shingle, and a term that if you ever look in to any of the technical literature on shingles and shingle construction that talk about the common bond area. The common bond area is the area between the lower portion of shingle and the upper portion that's overlaying the laminated shingles. And that area where the two meet and overlap, that's called a common bond. And there's an adhesive layer or adhesive strip in there that bonds those two layers together. But physically, there's on all of the shingles on the right-hand side only have between 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch of a common bond area. So you can see up here on that CertainTeed shingle that I pointed to earlier in the previous slide, you can see those two blue lines orient directly over that common bond area, but far enough above the bottom edge so that you won't get a shiner or a nail being exposed when you overlay the next shingle over the top of it. So ideally, when you nail there, you're catching both layers of shingles. Now, on a shingle like the middle one, where there is no indicator line to show you where to put the nail, you're going to have to just gauge it by eye to be just enough up off of that cutout section without being too high to be above that common bond area. So here we got I forgot all the Owens Corning at the bottom, and I know the CertainTeed at the top, and I think it might be a GAF in the middle, but I could be wrong on that. Over on the left-hand side, I've got an Atlas shingle. There's only two companies, at least of right now that I know of, that are making a standard laminated shingle that give you a taller common bond area of between 1 3/4 and 1 7/8. And that's Atlas shingles, the one I have here. And the other is the Malarkey shingles, which I know usually don't make it much east of the Mississippi, at least right now. So you'll find those more towards the Western US and the West Coast. But those are the only two shingles that I know of right now that have that extended common bond. And I think that's a good idea because it gives you a wider range for putting the nails and trapping both layers of shingle underneath the nail head, so you don't have so you've got more resistance to nail head pull through in the event of a wind getting underneath that shingle. There is, and this is not widely publicized in the shingle manufacturer's installation instructions. The only way I found out about this was I was reading CertainTeed and a couple other companies have like this, it's like a shingle installer's handbook, or it's a certified installer's manual that has like these self quizzes so that you can kind of test yourself, or they might even use it to get the certified installer's designation. There was a little blurb in a little text on one of their pages in one of the guidebooks that said, even though you have these extended nail ranges, the common bond high wind range, plus the low wind or average wind range, which extends up into the head lap or top lap of the shingle, there's a spot, and it's 1/8 of an inch above where the cutout or where the top of the common bond is. Do not, and it said right in the instructions, do not put a nail on that spot. And a couple years ago, I was at a JLC Live, and I asked a CertainTeed, they had one of their technical reps there, the people that test their shingles. I said, why is it you can't put a nail right there? And why don't you make it more explicit? And they said, well, we in the engineering department, of course, would like to make it more explicit, but you know, we're just one voice amongst many in the whole process of making and selling shingles. So they didn't want to put a red do not nail line because it would just confuse people, but they did put it in the text. He said the reason is you can see the thickness of the lower portion of the shingle at the common bond. It's whatever, 1/16 of an inch or 3/32 of an inch, something like that. When you drive a nail just above that point, what can happen is there's a little hollow spot right there where you got the thickness of the shingle overlapped. And when you drive the nail down, if the nail pushes down even flush with that, it can fracture the fiberglass mat. And the fiberglass mat is essentially what keeps shingles together. The asphalt that they put on through, that they wet through the fiberglass mat, and the granules on the top have no real structural capacity. Structural capacity is all on the fiberglass mat. So when the nail goes in and it fractures that fiberglass mat because it breaks that, snaps it as it goes over that sharp edge of that underlying shingle layer, it can reduce the nail holding power or the shingle power to resist wind-driven or high winds that can lift the shingle off. So just be aware, don't nail there. Now, I don't know if that's the case on all shingle brands. It was just a certain teed folks that I spoke to, but I would think their geometry is all the same when they're manufactured. So it might be, you might want to pay close attention to not putting a shingle directly above, just to avoid any potential problem there. At the rake edges, and this is only my recommendation, just something I do. It wasn't anything that the Institute for Business and Home Safety tested, but when you're driving the nails along the rake edge into the shingle, make sure you're going into something solid. A lot of times the trim for the exterior along the rake edge, it could be a rake board. There might even be a strip that pads the rake board off of the framing, and it might be that the wall sheathing went up to the upper plane of the roof, so that the roof sheathing itself is back maybe 2 or 3 inches from the actual edge of the shingle. By the time you add an overhang for the drip edge, a pad out beyond a rake board, the rake board itself, plus a spacer, plus the wall sheathing. To get into something solid, you need to be back a couple of inches. So just be aware of where that distance is, so you don't nail in between 2 layers or something in that fascia assembly sandwich, because if you get between 2 boards, it's really not going to hold as well as if you're in the wood. So ideally, you'd be putting a nail into the framing as well as the roof sheathing. So what I like to do is I like to put in a couple of nails right around where that roof truss or roof rafter is going to be, so that I'm ensured that I'm going to be hitting that, or at least into the roof sheathing next to that. That's just going to, in my mind anyway, and this is just using you call it informed guesswork, that's going to hold better than just a nail that goes into anywhere out towards the outer part there, into the rake board or something like that. It's particularly if you're into cellular PVC trim and other types of composite trims, which don't have as much nail holding power as solid wood does. Nailing and fastening on hip and ridge shingles. Now, if you're going up a hip like this, where you don't have any ridge vent on it, then by all means, you can improve the cap shingles being held down over the hip by using either, by bonding it down, by using either roof cement over the shingles underneath and then putting the shingles down, or by using that double-sided self-adhering membrane, that roof edge seal. The nice thing I like about the roof edge seal that would be separate from, or would be different than if I put down the roof cement, is that it actually caps over the top, sort of as if putting an underlayment over the top, or a piece of peel and stick over the top of your hip shingles. Now you can cross wrap the shingles over the hip. The problem with that, with laminated shingles, is you end up bulking up that hip, which means you got to use some really long nails to get through it, because now you've got probably 4 layers, and when you put the cap on, now you've got 5 layers of shingles cross-lapping over potentially. So by cutting the shingles right at the hip, you can keep the profile of the hip a little bit lower, so it doesn't look like it's kind of bulked up right there. But you're going to risk having that hip joint open to the underlayment beneath, because the shingles are just butt up to it. That's where I like putting that self-adhering cap over the top of it, and then putting the finished cap shingles on. As far as the shingles themselves, figuring that they get bonded down by whatever means you decide to use, the right nail length. So the regular roofing nails, if you're using 1.25 inch, 1.5 roofing nails across the regular part of the roof, are probably not going to be quite long enough. You're probably going to need to go to 1.75 inch or a 2-inch nail, which a lot of the nail guns will drive the 1.75 and 2-inch nails. You're going to want those so that you ensure that you're getting good penetration down into the roof sheathing and maybe into some framing. But in addition to putting down the, using the right length nail, it would be double nailing. When I say double nailing, it's really hard to see without zooming in, but there's 2 nails, one here where my pointer is going and the other one right there. So there's 2 nails. Most of these cap shingles are only single layer, so we're not going to get into that common bond area because there isn't one on a lot of the cap shingles. So we're just going into single layer shingle just above the self-seal strip and then putting 2 of them down. 2, I think anyway, is going to be a little bit more resistant than 1. And then you can adjust all of these recommendations based on your, your climate zone and what you can actually expect. On the hip and ridge cap shingles, now those, of course, you're going to need to install, if you're installing them, I should say, over a ridge vent, then depending on the type of ridge vent, you may or may not be able to use that bonding idea. Here with this ridge vent, it's a full plastic cap, which is smooth, so I could use that double-sided self-adhered membrane on there. So individually, we've nailed down the ridge vent with the manufacturer's supply 3 or 3.5 inch ring shank roof nails. And then we install our own 3-inch roof nails, double nailed. And of course, this case, because there are 3-inch nails going into the roof shingles through the cap, we're going to have to hand nail those because there aren't any roofing guns to do that. But that extra self-adhering double-sided membrane or roof cement on top of there can just help to resist the nails blowing off. Now, selecting the ridge vent itself, there's no standard ICC test that I know of that is now testing ridge vent, but there is one that the Miami-Dade and Florida Building Code put together for testing of the ridge vent to make sure, one, it stays in place when it's nailed down to meet the 130 to 150 mile an hour wind resistant, but also to make sure that it is water resistant in the event that you're getting wind-driven rain. Now, I don't know, Matt, did you look into these tests and how they do the testing and how wind resistant they really are, and if any ridge vents did not meet that qualification, or did you find that, I know you looked into it a little bit more than I did.
Yeah, I do remember reading into it. And it was the TOS 100 test that is I can't remember exactly what it's called. It's like the TOS 100. I can't remember exactly, but
that's what it is, because that's what I've got on my slide.
Oh, that's what you've got on your screen. But yeah, beyond that, I really don't remember.
Okay. So I know, I would say when I look through, I would look through like 5 or 6 of the different ridge vents that I've used in the last few years, and all of them had that wind resistance rating. Most of them have what are called internal baffles. So they're usually a roll type or like a 3 or 4 foot long straight section pieces, but they're usually a plastic and they have either external or an internal baffles. It's just like a tortured path that the water has to go up and through, and then it gives channels that the water can then drain out. So those baffled ones tend to be the more wind resistant ones, it look like, or at least water resistant, I should say, when they did that test. But it is a good thing that there is a test out there that somebody's doing, and the companies that do have their ridge vent meeting that test requirement do put that in their literature to say that it is that TAS 100A-95 test. So look for that. And then hand sealing. This can be done as a cold weather measure so what happens in the cold weather is those self-sealing tabs that seal each overlying course of shingles don't bond down super well until the sun gets on it or you get into warm weather. Once they bond, all of those, once they've been activated, all of those bonds on the shingles that meet that that H wind classification will bond well enough to be able to meet that 130 to 150 mile an hour wind resistance. But if you're working in working at the cold time of the year, you're not going to get that without you taking the extra time to hand seal down a roof. It's a real pain in the butt. I've done it when I work, when I've done it is when I'm working right along a coast or a big open field or along a big freshwater or saltwater lake or estuary, where you know that the wind speeds are going to be higher than in a wooded area where the trees around can at least diminish the some of the wind. And in those cases, when I roof in the winter, we go back and we hand seal it down. The manufacturers have some specifications for that. They don't want you going crazy with the roof cement. Again, it can't be any more than 1/8 of an inch thick, and you want to stay in the quarter to a $half size circles. You don't want to be big splotches or taking a trowel and smearing it all underneath each layer, because you can actually cause a little more damage to the shingle than you'd think because of those oils that are in that would end up deteriorating the asphalt in the shingle, making it a little bit too soft. Where I put it on for extra wind resistance is on the cap shingles. So even though I put down the self-sealing membrane down along the hips and along the ridge underneath the caps, that's really sealing down the cap shingle head lap. It's not the lower lap. That lower portion of the exposure part is only being sealed down by the self-seal tabs. So adding a couple extra dots of roof cement can help there. And definitely along the rake edges, it's well worthwhile to just lift up each and every tab all the way down the exposure portion and just put one small bead of roof cement from a gunnable tube. That's all, one, maybe two stripes, and that way you're going to seal that whole edge down to help resist the wind uplift from along the rake edge. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That covers all 9 of those things. The recording, so if you didn't catch the whole thing, you can catch a recording of it. I think, Rob, you said early next week will probably be when you put it up?
Yes, we usually get it within one day, but since it's the weekend, it'll probably be on Monday or sometime on Monday.
Okay. And then all of the webinars, this one as well as the one I did last week on stormproofing a roof, as well as all the upcoming ones, will be on the Fine Homebuilding webpage. If you can hang with us for just a second, Rob had some poll questions he'd like to ask some of you, or he's going to take over the screen. But if you do have questions or comments, about this session, you can get in touch with Fine Homebuilding through email, just fh@taunton.com. Well, thanks everybody, and look forward to you joining us for the next webinar.